descendants to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, that you may live. What is being said here by Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verse 6 is, God is interested in you having a heart that has been removed of defilement, a heart that is devoted to Him. That you get rid of this useless idolatry and this useless sinful behavior, and that you have a circumcised heart. Jeremiah 31:31, God says, I will write my law upon their hearts. The law would no longer be written on tablets of stone, but God wanted that law written upon their hearts. Now don't get me wrong, they were expected to keep the commandment of circumcision, but God was more interested in them being circumcised in an inward kind of way. Because just because they had that outward sign of the flesh didn't mean they were going to live it. Didn't mean they were going to live up to the expectations spelled out in the Old Testament law. And so God was interested in them making sure that their hearts were circumcised and that the descendants' hearts were circumcised as well. And so his circumcision was received as a seal. We read that just a moment ago in Romans chapter 4. Seal means, or actually the seal serves as a means of identification or a mark of possession. If you put a seal on something, it means that that belongs to the person who sent it, okay? A long time ago, when a person would send out an official letter, they would melt some wax on it, and they'd take a signet ring or some other signet, and they would press it into that wax to seal it, to let them know that it was an official communique that had something in it that was important that needed to be read. It was done that way in part to make sure that it was not opened and read, before it arrived at the person who was supposed to look at it. It may have been for their eyes only. And so it was an identification, letting somebody know that this came from a king or some other important person in the government. We have this quote about a seal. As such, it served as a source of assurance to Abraham that God had truly accepted him and counted him righteous because of his faith. The point that Paul makes from this is that it shows that Abraham was already justified before he received circumcision, since a seal does not confer that which it ratifies, but assumes it already exists. A seal does not confer that which it ratifies, but assumes it already exists. And so this is the point. Most of us are familiar with buying a home. In order to buy a home, you have to sign a contract. And when you sign a contract, what do? What do you typically do? You got to give them some earnest money. That earnest money is a type of seal. Is that earnest money the contract itself? No. But that earnest money shows people that you are completely serious about the fact that you've just entered into a contractual agreement to buy this house or this piece of property. Now, if you fail in honoring that contract, they keep the money. That's part of the contract. But the money itself is not the contract. It is merely a guarantee that you're going to follow through with the contractual agreement. Same is true with circumcision. It was a guarantee that God had made to Abraham that I'm going to honor this covenant that I've made with you. Namely, one is saved prior to baptism, and that, let me start over. Many people in Christendom want to connect what Paul says in these passages with baptism and claim that baptism is a sign of something that has already happened prior to being immersed. Namely, one is saved prior to baptism, and their immersion is merely an outward sign of something that has already happened. And this is a false teaching for a few reasons. And let's look at these. Number one, circumcision was never a sign and seal that pertained to salvation. Never was. As we noted, it was a sign of the covenant relationship that God would honor. It was a seal, a guarantee that God would honor the covenant that he had struck with Abraham. It was a sign of the covenant relationship that God had with the Jews, but it did not necessarily mean that a Jew would be saved, okay? If you were circumcised on the 8th day, that was a part of the covenant agreement that God had with you as a Jew, but that didn't mean you had to live it. God was not going to force you to live as a faithful Jew. You could be disobedient to it. to the law of Moses. It was a sign of righteousness by faith only for Abraham. It was not a sign of righteousness for any other individual under the Old Testament dispensation. However, from this false teaching, there emerged the idea that baptism was for babies and small children only. I did a lot of reading on this, and evidently there's this idea that we baptize babies when they're little because of the sign of circumcision. In the Old Testament, they are circumcised on the 8th day, and so the argument is made by a lot of friends in the religious world that babies have to be baptized for the very same reason. I found the argument to be decidedly false, but it helped me understand why they arrived at that false conclusion. Again, I'm not endorsing that. I'm just trying to explain how they came to that conclusion. And so, if circumcision exemplifies baptism, only male children could be immersed. Again, this refutes this idea that baptism is an outward sign of something that has already happened, because only a male child could be circumcised. So, if circumcision is an example of baptism, the only people who could be saved are males. Think about it. Think about it. To me, that one argument blows this fallacy out of the water. Colossians 2, 11 through 12, it's often used by a lot of people to support the alleged parallel between baptism and circumcision. And this is what it says: "In him you were also circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you also were raised with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead." What was baptism likened unto? Putting off the body of sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. And so this comment, the only analogy between circumcision and baptism, as per Colossians 2, 11 through 12, has to do with the fact that both involved putting off the flesh. Circumcision severs the flesh literally. But in baptism, one determines to sever himself from fleshly pursuits. That exhausts the connection between circumcision and baptism. That's it. Paul is saying putting off the sinful works of the flesh in Colossians 2 and comparing that to putting away this piece of flesh that was symbolic of the covenant agreement between God and man. It did not mean that baptism was an outward sign or seal of something that had already happened, because of the reasons that we just listed here. If that's the case, then only males could be baptized and be saved, because that was the only group that was required to have circumcision under the Old Testament law. Period. Okay, any thoughts or questions here before we go any further?
On the 8th day, why was the 8th day? We realize we know now. God came to keep me on the 8th day. The day the male child can be done on the first day. The first shot he gets is out of the cave. So it's amazing how God knew that. We took it, I guess, a couple thousand years to figure it out.
You're right. The bodies that cause the blood to coagulate and congeal so that clotting occurs were not active in a male child, or for that matter, any child's body, until the 8th day or later. So that's why it was, in fact, the 8th day, and there is scientific principle to support that particular idea. God knew what he was doing. Anyone else? Thoughts, comments, questions?
Johnny, if they try to state that baptism is something that's occurred because of faith, because forgiveness has already been given, then how do they explain Acts 22 and 16? Because Saul had to have faith. He believed Jesus and followed his instructions. Because in 22:10 it says that he be told everything that was appointed unto him to do. And he followed those instructions. He had to have faith. So what was wrong with Saul? It didn't work for him.
You know, I don't know. I'd ask that question myself, but you know, my belief is he had to be immersed in compliance with the commandment of God. But again, that's another example and passage that flies in the face of the idea of being saved by faith only, because, again, on the road to Damascus, you better believe Paul was a believer when he came into contact with Jesus. If somebody came to me in a blinding light, yeah, I'd believe. And then he goes on into Damascus, and Ananias is told to seek him out. And, oh, by the way, Ananias, he's going to be praying. So those are the two elements of salvation according to Protestant denominationalism, faith and prayer. Yet his sins were not washed away until baptism, Acts 22 and verse 16, which was done in compliance with everything that he had been appointed to do, as commanded by Christ through the preaching of Ananias, teaching of Ananias. And so, yeah, I don't know how people get around that idea or arrive at the conclusion that a person is saved by faith only. And even if they try to use this idea about circumcision and draw a parallel to it in baptism, ultimately it falls apart. Because I think the number one thing that kills it in my mind is, if that's a parallel, then that means only males can be saved, period. Because they were only ones subjected to the law of circumcision in the Old Testament.
Well, this procedure didn't work for Apostle Paul. What makes anybody else think that it's going to happen when God didn't carry it out?
I really don't know. I truly don't know.
It's such a simple thing.
I think it is. It only becomes complicated when we start injecting man-made opinions, man-made ideas. Then it gets complicated, and we have to go through things like explaining why it can't be that based on what we've read here in the book of Romans.
Very reason that he wants us not to follow man's doctrine and try to institute that for his doctrine.
Yeah. Any more comments, questions? Okay. We'll get into this next week, but this is stuff you probably already know. So, thank you for your attention.